Now in this comparison, we're going to be comparing the SMSL SH-6 and the IE Magni. Quick note on the Magni. This Magni specifically is not available anymore. The only Magnis that they offer are the 3 Plus and the Heresy. Now because of all the Magni's performance being so similar, I'm basically going to group them all into one category, though the one I would probably recommend the most right now would be the Heresy, just personal preference. Now you will notice that if you go on Shit's website and not on Amazon, that it's $99, but you do have to pay shipping, and that gets it about pretty close, within a few bucks of about 120 bucks. So these are, in my opinion, basically the same price. Now some quick back history. The Magnis have basically dominated this price category for just about as long as I can remember them coming out. They originally offered really high power output for not that much money, but weren't that great on specs or sound quality, but they offered a lot of power, and this is way back in the day. Then they progressively kept the same amount of power, but got better and better spec performance while maintaining just about the same build. This SMSL line is relatively new, not only within the last few months for this, but actually within the last few years for the SH line in general. So today we're going to be comparing the two, and I'm going to tell you if this has enough to dethrone the current reigning champion at about $120. So these things have a ton of crossover points. So let me go over some of the similarities first. They both feature RCA inputs and RCA outputs. They also feature a 1/4 inch headphone output, a volume knob, of course. They have high and low gain switches, of course, an on and off switch for both. And they both feature a pre-out out of those RCAs at the back. They're very similar in size, the SMSL being a little bit squattier and wider, and the Magni being a tiny bit taller. And they are very close to about the same weight, but the SMSL is a little bit heavier. Now for the money, I think both are very nice designs. They both feature metal, and while it's a different machining practice, the machining on both is relatively good. I would say that the machining edge does go to the SMSL though, mostly because this entire top portion of the amp, both the top actual face of it and the sides and the back and the front, this is all one piece of machined aluminum, and the only separate plate is on the very bottom, and you can see a nice line where that kind of fits into that tub. Now this, along with the chamfered edge, for the price, is actually a pretty decent build, and I do think it's a little bit superior to that of the Magni. Now there are some notable advantages to the build of the SMSL over the IE Magni. Let me go over a few here. Number one is actually going to be the power supply for the both. So this is the power brick that you need to run this IE Magni. This is the power supply for the actual unit, and then you have the small cable that you have to run up through here. But this in your surge protector is pretty hefty. This is the cable, which is just a standard 2-pin cable for the SMSL. This one actually comes with a separate ground that you can link to your SMSL if you want to, though it does work without that. It's just not quite as well protected. And the power supply for this is actually inbuilt into this SMSL, which for the weight and the size of this thing is pretty impressive. I much prefer this system on the SMSL than I do this system on the Magni. Other notable changes are that you can actually select whether or not you want to play headphones out the front or pre-out at the back, and you can leave both plugged in and just switch between headphones and pre-out, which is unlike the IE Magni. The other benefits are the volume knob is a little bit easier to grip on the SMSL because of the grooves, and the potentiometer inside of it is, in my opinion, quite superior to the slightly gritty one on the IE Magni. Last small but notable advantage to the build of the SMSL is that the light for both off, headphone output, and pre-output, they're 3 different lights, and they're on the front, so you can actually see them if you cover it, unlike the IE Magni, which if you do cover it, you cannot see that it's even on because you have to view that from the top. And it's only one color, which is red. Oh, actually I lied about that being the last benefit. The last benefit, in my opinion, of the SMSL is that all the switches are on the front, not the rear like the Magni has. So you don't have to reach around and kind of guess where you're which switch you're clicking. Beyond the physical build, each of these has their own gain stage settings. The SMSL only has 2, the Magni has 3, and I do think it is notable that the low gain on the Magni is very, very low. That makes really sensitive IEMs a joy to use on this because you have so much headroom for the volume knob before it becomes like a volume problem and becomes too loud for you to listen. You have less control, though still good control with the SMSL. It's just not quite as sensitive as the IE Magni is. So as far as some specs, these are similar in some areas and vastly different in some others. So let's talk about power output. Into 16 ohms, these are similar. The SMSL puts out about 2.6 watts. The IE Magni puts out about 2.8. A slight power difference there. There's a bigger power difference at 32 ohms, which this will put out about 2.4, and the SMSL will put out about 1.3. And there's no further specs for the SMSL, so I can't really compare them. The IE Magni is a little bit more powerful, but in terms of some of the other specifications and measurements, the SMSL does pull ahead. It has substantially lower total harmonic distortion numbers, being 0.00007%, and then this is just 0.006%. Or 3% or something like that. It's not that big of a deal in terms of the end user, but in terms of spec chasers, this is clearly the superior one. This also has a much greater signal to noise ratio, being about 135 dB, and this is only about 115 dB on its low gain setting. So in terms of spec performance of the money, you do sacrifice a little bit of power, though it's not a major sacrifice in my opinion. Both are very powerful amplifiers, but you get better specs. So if you're a spec chaser, you're probably already eyeballing this one. I do think it's worth mentioning that both have good specs for the money. In fact, great specs for the money. They're some of the top players in that price category. But I also think it's worth mentioning that both headphone amplifiers will drive just about any headphone that anybody out there has. There are very few headphones that will actually cause power problems for either of these amplifiers. Okay, so for sound, this was surprisingly more difficult of a task to analyze than I was anticipating. Both of these are really good performing amplifiers, and I had to climb quite high on the headphone hierarchy to get headphones that I felt like were revealing enough for each of these. I would say if you're in the realm of like a 6XX and things like that, you're not going to notice much of a difference between these two. And I think you could probably just go based off of either looks, whichever you prefer visually, or function, whichever has better functions for you, which I think for most people is going to be the SMSL. I think treble is the most easily identifiable difference between these two. The SMSL for some reason sounds a little more glassy to me. It sounds a little bit more shimmery and shiny, but it's also a tad bit brighter in the top end relative to the slightly more musical top end of the IE Magni. I think this is a bit more saturated for color, but maybe less sharp and less technical. Mid-range voicing is kind of interesting here because I feel like the SMSL is a little bit more forward for the voicing, but this definitely has, I think, better harmonic properties to it. Voices seem a little bit freer to sound more naturalistic on the IE Magni, and they seem a little bit more timbre bottled in the SMSL. Like it almost seems like it's less free to express itself, even though technicality and detail are, I think, a little bit ahead of the IE Magni. But where I actually noticed a decent difference was in the different dynamic range properties for voices of both. I do feel like the SMSL is more dynamic in the top end, whereas the IE Magni tends to fill at the lower end a little bit stronger than it does the top end. What I can't figure out here is if this means that the lower mid-range is suppressed on the SMSL, or if the upper mid-range is suppressed on the IE Magni. If I had to guess a reference, I'd probably resort to specifications and measurements, and I would say that this is probably a better reference, but both are pretty good and both are quite enjoyable to listen to. For bass, to be frank, I've been listening to a lot of really high-end amplifiers that are very good for bass recently, and so going to this, it does feel like a notable downgrade to me, though judging at the price category, both I think are fairly competent and perform very similar to one another, and I almost found no differences in the sub-bass regions between these two. Both of them are confident, they're strong, they're very clear, and I don't have any problems listening to very, very good bass headphones with these. I think it's quite awesome. Now, one of the areas that I anticipated a lot of difference was going to be the placement difference, because I felt like back in the day, the Magnis had a very sort of centralized sound. There wasn't a whole lot of background and sound staging width like you would get with a lot of people used to compare these to a lot of tubes, because way back in the day, you didn't have a ton of these lower end amplifiers. You really only had a few selections for like under $400 to $500 back in the day. So you'd get these odd comparisons, and now they're a lot more direct head-to-head comparisons. So they're both easier to compare and more fair to compare, but also much more difficult because of that. Now, when the 3 Plus and the Heresy came out, I felt like that changed and they started performing a lot better and not so focused of a sound signature. Though, honestly, I don't really notice any position difference between these two. So listening to a song from Terrace Martin like Intimidated, I would notice that the bass guitar would manifest a little bit more differently between amplifier to amplifier. I would also notice that some of the background noises would come from slightly alternate positions or different distances. but not here. I feel like this is very comparable in this area. For me, the point I want to make is that bottom line so far, sonically, these are both extremely competent devices, but they will probably lean towards one person's preference over another. So if you want a slightly more technical, precise amplifier, I'd say the SMSL does that. And if you want a slightly more musical, though still a very technical and precise amplifier, the IE Magni is probably the one for you. Now, regarding the rest of it, regarding the other comparative aspects, I do feel like the build and features are just simply superior on the SMSL. I think the next generation of the Magni should focus less on measurements and maybe more on features to be a little bit more competitive. Because right now, assuming that they're about equal for sonic prowess, I would say that the SMSL is going to be the new champ. It's just got better specs, a better build. It does have a more clinical sound signature, but I found that some people really like that and some people don't like that. Now I know because this has been such a reigning champ for so long, a lot of people have a lot of nostalgia and strong feelings about this. I'm not saying this is a bad amp at all. This is the second best amp at this category, which is no joke because nowadays there's a ton of amps that are budget amplifiers, and I think these two are probably the top of the pack till about $200, in which case I would really recommend getting something like a Magnus. So that's going to be the breakdown of the Magni versus the SH-6. All right, guys, thanks a lot for watching. Until the next video, my name's Josh, signing off. Peace.